answer your question is I search for two things in life. One, I search for truth, and I try and keep an open mind as to where truth lies. I don't let my scientific background or religious background influence me. And I search for goodness, what's to be a good person and just do good to others. And so, and I don't mean to disrespect anybody's views here. I simply stating where I think the answer lies, so that we can all live in peace and harmony, and hopefully never go to war again, and never enacting violence upon each other.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Melting Pot Talks. We got another great episode for you today. Although, today's episode is going to stray a little bit from our usual format. You see, originally we had 3 guests from 3 different backgrounds and locations lined up to have a conversation about the intersection of personal faith, public policy, and elected officials. Unfortunately, 2 of them had to cancel at the very last minute. Instead of canceling the show, we adjusted a bit and had more of a traditional one-on-one interview with our remaining guest, Gerald. While it wasn't what we had originally planned, I'm grateful that Gerald agreed to stick around and continue the conversation with me. I think it's important to note, aside from connecting about doing the show and scheduling, I had not met or talked to Gerald prior to us jumping on the call and recording this episode. Our goal here at Melting Pot Talks is to provide a space for people to explore these issues honestly and in good faith, as well as encourage you to do the same right along with us. I think we maintain the spirit of our mission with this episode, and I'm very excited to share what came out of the conversation. As usual, we'll provide some more detailed information about today's guests at the end of the show, as well as provide his bio and links in the podcast notes. So without any further delay, let's talk about it. Gerald, thank you so much for being on the show today and taking this kind of divergent path than what we had originally planned. But I appreciate you coming on and being willing to speak your mind as well. But we're gonna move forward and get your thoughts on the matter of separation of church and state, and essentially how personal faith intersects with public service and public life. So I'd like to start off by asking, is there a particular religious or even non-religious worldview that informs your day-to-day actions and decisions?
Chris, first, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think this will be a fun discussion. And that's a very good question. And that really sets me to thinking, because it's not something that we really think about in our day-to-day life. What exactly determines my worldview? And I'd love to give you a short Reader's Digest answer, but I can't. To give you a complete answer, it's going to take me a minute or two. So hopefully we have time for that. But basically, I'm a Catholic, and I also have a Bachelor of Science degree. And some years ago, I was working out of town, and I decided, this was 22 years ago, 23 years ago. I wanted to get a book on what it was like in the times of Jesus, what his life was like, what life was like in general. Not a religious book, just a book about life. And so I went to the library, and quite by accident, I took out this book that was a completely revisionist view of Christianity. And it got me thinking, and I don't know how it got me, but I just started thinking, I'm going to research all these different views about religion, about science. And having a Bachelor of Science degree also, in science, you learn to think for yourself, rationalize everything through. And so I spent last 20-some years on a long journey studying a lot of philosophy, a lot of religion, a lot of science. And it's taken me down paths I could never imagine. And where it's basically led me to answer your question is I search for 2 things in life. One, I search for truth. And I try and keep an open mind as to where truth lies. I don't let my scientific background or religious background influence me. And I search for goodness, what's to be a good person and just do good to others. And so what guides my day-to-day life is those two things. I search for truth in regards to science, religion, philosophy, and I try and be a good person. Hope that answers the question. That's how I got there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting, again, that the intersection of personal faith and that ultimate, search that I think most of us are on in one aspect or another. So it's kind of diving into that, though. To what extent then do you think that the specific doctrine or the prescribed rules and mandates of your personal faith, then how does that inform those day-to-day decisions, and how does that overlap with your search for truth and what you found along the way with your own personal truths? Because one has been dictated and one has been explored and found by yourself.
That's a very good question. And it's a very good question because so many people that don't understand the Catholic faith, and they think they do, and it's portrayed as this, especially in today's Hollywood movies. It's always portrayed as these evil priests who want to condemn everyone to hell. But the Catholic Church is an amazing institution that I encourage everyone to look into, and I say that because the Catholic Church started the university system that we know. That was the Catholic Church started and protected science. So the church and science actually are very much, the Catholic Church and science are very much in step with each other on many, many things. So I'm finding the intersection of the two, they gel quite well for me in my search for truth and goodness, I guess. They actually seem to really work well together.
Yeah, and I think that probably is going to be a little different depending on the specific rules and doctrines of an individual's selected faith. Did you think that the specific doctrines and rules that come along with your faith also allow you that freedom to explore and kind of find your own way within the faith itself?
Very, very much so. In studying, in my study of science and religion and philosophy and such, I found out a lot of things I didn't realize. One thing I found out was that the church is it's portrayed as so doctrinal, and everything comes down from the top, and it's authoritative, and it's not so. The Catholic Church has only declared two things that they consider undiscussable. Not undiscussable, that's not the word for it. They consider to be, we are correct on this based on all the evidence, and both of them relate to Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else is they have not declared anything that we have determined in our research, in our studies. We have determined this to be indisputably true. So they actually leave a lot of room for leeway. And in fact, the church makes it, the Catholic, when I say the church, I mean the Catholic Church, makes it very clear that whatever science discovers,
Mm-hmm.
that's science's field. The church tries to stay out of science, and if science discovers something, then it must be true. And for example, a lot of folks don't realize it, but the church is not against evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Incidentally, I don't quite believe in evolution based on scientific facts. Nothing to do with religion. I could care less from a religious standpoint. But I've studied evolution, and a lot of evolutionary biologists themselves they don't even know what the mechanism is. If evolution, and when I say evolution, I don't mean the increasing diversity of species. That is almost beyond discussion true. But I'm talking about where an amoeba could turn into a human.
Mm-hmm.
That I have a hard time scientifically, from a scientific standpoint. I look at the evidence, and I look at the arguments, and I've listened to a lot of evolutionary biology, and so I guess I'm rambling a bit. So basically, yes, there's a lot of leeway in the faith side of things for me to believe the scientific side of things.
And I think that that's kind of probably a good segue to the kind of the next step in this conversation is, so there's there's a sphere of influence and personal choices that we have to make in our own personal day-to-day choices and decisions, and how does our personal faith, how does that inform our actions? But let's move out concentrically a little bit. And what extent do you think the doctrines included in these religious worldviews inform the laws, the unspoken rules, and the general moral landscapes of, you know, we'll go with your community first, and we can kind of expand out from there, because that's obviously a very diverse answer too, depending on geographically where you're at, culturally, even time based, right? But let's just talk about right now. So, where do you see the views that you hold personally, or at least adjacent to them? How do you see those influencing the culture within which you live?
Very good question. And I definitely do want to expand it out because I did study the U.S. Constitution and the First Amendment, and I found some amazing stuff in there. And actually, the U.S. Constitution and the First Amendment are very relevant to the discussion of separation church and state. So I hope we don't forget that. But in our community, we're at a very interesting point right now, and both the U.S. and Canada are an interesting point. The city and province that I'm in is very left-leaning, liberal, and a lot of the more radical left beliefs these days are taking a fairly strong hold in our area right now. So they're being I wouldn't say the dominant viewpoint by any stretch of the imagination, but they are dominating the discussion and the narrative right now in our country. And our federal government passed a legislation called Bill C-16 that actually starts to limit free speech. So I don't want to, it's off topics. I shouldn't, but anyways, that's the kind of the landscape where we are. It's leaning more left right now.
So, and you see that as a bit divergent from, the maybe the personal belief system that you adhere to and were raised in. But do you think that there is a codified worldview, with these, with mandates and rules similar to Catholicism
Uh,
that are informing that in your
got,
space? Then where are these ideas being generated, and is it from the ground up, or is it being, again, is it being dictated from somewhere else?
Gotcha. Well, I don't want to get off too far off the discussion, but the left views are coming from what's called postmodernism, is a very dominating movement at the moment, and that's informing a lot of the left side view in our area. In North America as a whole, I know a lot of folks. Some folks don't like to admit this, but actually, our original legislation and our laws and the codified rules and regulations actually were based very much on the Judeo-Christian principles, not because they wanted to create a Judeo-Christian state. That wasn't the case, and certainly not with the U.S., certainly not with Canada. But if you go back in history and you study the study of ethics, right back to Aristotle, you study what constitutes goodness, what constitutes beauty, where do laws come from, and those kinds of things. There's different views. They're called consequentialism, non-consequentialism, and basically the non-consequentialist view is that the laws and the codes that we live by come from a higher being or a higher state. And there's two versions of that. One version coming from a religious entity, such as the God we know. Others saying no, it comes from the universe itself. It's just something we know. It's innate. So I think that informed the society we live in up until modern times. Modern times being the last 20 years, where the more postmodern view is starting to really get into the narrative. Did that answer your question? Did I?
Yeah, no, I think so. And I know these, we ask these questions, and you really do have to, we really have to kind of bring it down to a narrow perspective in order to talk about it, because we're talking about, again, one geographic region in this point in time, and they're all interrelated, and they do evolve as time goes on, but we would be here for many hours and days if we were to kind of give the entire timeline across the globe. So I am just kind of using your experience and your location in this given time as a placeholder, and like, this is our example that we're just talking about this specific aspect right now. So, given that where these laws came from, you were saying, originally a lot of them did kind of stem from Judeo-Christian doctrine. Now, a lot of the laws and rules are coming from more of a postmodernist viewpoint. What do you think the appropriateness of this is on a cultural, societal level? We'll go next to we'll bring it back down to the individual, to the policymakers themselves, but from a high level governmental or cultural position, like, do you think that it's appropriate to be using these larger ethos to inform how we are governed?
The short answer is absolutely not. And by that, I don't just mean postmodernism. I also mean, Christianity, which I ascribe to. I think governments have to take a secular view of things. And so to have any sort of worldview dominating laws and dominating how we are regulated is probably not a good thing. Governments need to take a middle of the road approach and look at every point of view and try and find the common ground, and that's where we need to aim for, I think.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to get into that a little bit later too.
Okay.
Let's put a pin in that, because I think that's a really important part of this discussion, and that goes into the how. But again, I think another aspect of this is we've talked about you as a citizen, as an individual. We've talked about culture in general, kind of on the larger scale. But we also have this intermediary where we have individuals who are the ones writing a lot of this policy and creating this policy, right? So again, to what extent do you think it's appropriate for the elected officials to be guided by the specific doctrine that's prescribed or mandated in their religious or non-religious worldview? And how do you find balance there, right? Because you can't not have a worldview. Nobody's a blank slate, right? Everybody has biases one way or the other, or beliefs that might conflict with a purely secular view. But to what extent do you think it's appropriate for elected officials to bring that into their decision-making process?
Oh, great question. And that's a very, very difficult one to answer, as you probably know. We all have to be true to ourselves. And whatever our worldview is, if you believe in your worldview, and if you rationally and logically believe in it and you think it's a good thing, you've got to be true to yourself. But now when we get elected into the public arena, things change. You're not there to represent yourself. One of the most beautiful statements ever made was Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, right? Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so when you get elected, to use that as our aiming point, which I think is a fantastic aiming point, we are now for the people, and that means all the people. So you've got to set your worldview aside, I think, as something when you're governing, and you need to look at everybody's worldviews, I think. So I don't know if that answers the question. And I don't mean set it aside, because there are some things in your faith that if you're a faith person that you cannot set aside, but you cannot also force them on others. So it's a very, very difficult question to answer. And as an elected official, all you can do is your best to find find that point where it works for the people.
Yeah, and that's exactly the segue that I think we can use to kind of tie all this together, right? So again, we have the individual citizen, their personal beliefs and needs, the elected politician, and we will we will specify elected representatives and politicians for the sake of this conversation. I think we could talk about other other ways of governance that are more dictatorial, or where the will of the people may not have a as much of a say. But I think for the purposes here, we're gonna go with a representative government example. So we have the citizens themselves, and then the elected officials, and then the rules that should be filtering up from the bottom. But how do you think that balance is found between I mean, the name of this podcast is the Melting Pot Talks. It's because that's, if you're in a multicultural society, you're not going to have a continuity between the beliefs of the citizenry. So you mentioned earlier about looking at the needs for the people, and using that to guide policy decisions. How do you do that when the needs of the people might be different depending on their specific faiths?
Oh wow, hey, that's the question of the day, isn't it? For our societies.
No pressure, no pressure.
you know, that's a very great question, because, as you know, I'm up here in Canada and you're down there in the U.S., and both our countries are trying to achieve the same thing from slightly different angles. You're a republic and we are a parliamentary democracy. And so there's two things that need to be done. There's the bottom up, as you mentioned, which comes through your elected governments, right, toward the making of laws. And there's a top down, which comes from the court system, the legal system, which must be separated from the people and from government, so that it is free to make what they feel are the best decisions without any pressure from any special interest groups. And so your judges, I believe, are for the most part are elected. I don't know, are your Supreme Court justices elected? Do you know? Are they?
No, they're appointed, and then they have a senatorial approval process.
Okay. All right. And our judges are all appointed. So, some folks, I've heard the argument made that the U.S. system is not good because judges are under pressure to get elected. But our judges,
and I believe that is depending on the level of judge within the government, there are elected judicial members. Specifically for the Supreme Court, they're appointed by the president, and then they go through, like I said, there's a procedure in the Senate to approve and seat them. So as we've seen recently under the Trump administration, that was that there was a quite a bit of news surrounding the last two Supreme Court justice nominations and approvals. But we won't get into that. But there is, I am not an expert on that myself, so I don't want to get it too far into the weeds in that. But there are elected officials in that realm, as well as appointments too.
Yeah, there's a lot of rabbit holes we could end up going down. So, and the other argument about our judges, they are appointed, so sometimes they are beholden to the party that appoints them. So no process is perfect, but that's the process. Like, to answer the question, that's the closest we're coming to a perfect way of handling all the different needs of the people, right? The bottom up, and the top down approach, and the top down approach staying independent, so to speak.
What mechanisms do you think that you think work well, that you've seen for for identifying the needs and the will of the citizenry, of that the ground level people, that then can filter up to the top? And conversely, what mechanisms have you seen that you think work well to ensure that fairness from the top, that's the judicial aspect, that's then being filtered down to enforce those rules? Oh,
great question. Bottom up, I think probably the one most important thing, all democracies are built on one of the cornerstones of democracy and democratic process is free speech. And the definition basically of free speech is the ability to speak your mind, my ability to speak my mind, even though it may offend you, and your ability to speak your mind, even though it may offend me. And free speech, I think, I don't think it's known. It's the cornerstone of any democratic process. And so the free speech ensures that all voices are heard. And after all voices are heard and with sober reflection, hopefully we come to the best, what appears to be the best way to handle the concerns of the people. And then the politicians start to bring that up from the bottom up. Right? The judiciary, I think in both our countries, once a judge is in, other than an elected judge, but once an appointed judge is in, I think it's very difficult to get rid of them, which does lead to abuse, but it's a necessity because the top down has to be an independent process. They must look at, these are experts in the law. So politicians, and we see them in both our countries and in Europe, in any parliament, in democratic country, politicians bring laws up from the people through the free speech process. Quite often it gets to the courts, and the courts say, well, no, this does not balance all the rights and laws and rules for everybody properly. And so we strike this down, we amend it, however. So I've rambled so long, I've forgotten the question, but I think I've answered it.
Yeah. I think you have. Yeah, no, that was a big one too. I was asking, what mechanisms were in place to get that, to filter out the, the common needs of the people, going from the ground up, and also the, what mechanisms were in place to make sure that those were addressed. And also, I think you made a good point there as far as, do they adhere to our cultural morals and ensure that people's rights are being maintained. And I think that's that's a really interesting aspect of this conversation too, is granting and guaranteeing rights to people is a very moralistic perspective, and it's a very depending on, again, which cultural background you come from, those rights could be very subjective. So how do you how can you claim that a right is inalienable or granted without claiming some sort of dictation from an omniscient entity, right? Like how does a right get generated from the ground up? And there's some other there are some philosophical points of view on this. I've heard Sam Harris has some interesting thoughts about I think measuring wellness and well-being, but I think this adds a very interesting aspect to the topic of personal faith and religion and those morals, right? Do you have any thoughts on that specific on human rights and how the intersection of faith goes into those?
Good question. Thank you. You got some great questions today. They're really taxing my brain. I think it might be smoke coming out of my ears here. The whole issue of rights, there's a couple of concepts that everybody needs to be aware of in the issue of rights. One is this inalienable rights thing, but also the flip side of that coin that we often tend to forget about, because we often say, we've heard this phrase so many times, I know my rights, day in and day out, we hear that, but we never hear anybody say, I know my responsibilities. And rights do not come without responsibilities. One of the greatest rights in our democratic societies is the freedom of the press. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but they're in a crossing point, or I'm trying to find the right word. They're at a crucial point with regard to their responsibility. So there's a perfect example of what I'm trying to say. So the first thing is inalienable rights. And rights may be inalienable, but they are not, they don't exist in a vacuum. There's a famous saying, and if you Google it, it's attributed to about 100 different people. But there's an old saying, your right to extend your fist ends where my nose begins. Very powerful statement. So, we may have a right, but when our right starts to cross it into the boundary, over the boundary into somebody else's rights, then their rights come on the table as well. And we don't tend to remember that. And so, a process for managing all these competing rights is simply that. Am I extending my fist too close to your nose? And we don't often think that. We just simply say, I can extend my fist as far as I want. No, that's not right. So some rights are inalienable. Freedom of religion is pretty close to that. Freedom of the press is pretty close to that, but none are absolute. There's the word I was looking for. No rights are absolute. When they cross over into anybody else's right, then, and this, there's many court cases in our countries, many court cases. These are the most difficult ones where one right is bouncing off the edge of another right. So we have two competing rights. And, the court is the only place to handle those.
Yeah. And I think, I think those mechanisms possibly, then they do start to take the, that is one of the built-in mechanisms that takes the, it either interjects or it takes the faith-based subjective perspective out of the conversation, because then you do need to sit out and you need to argue, you need to make your argument. And I think at least in the US, on paper, that argument can't be because it says so in this religious text that I adhere to, right? You have to make another more substantial argument based on another set of standards. So maybe that's one of the mechanisms, like you said, the courts being in place is one of the mechanisms to which we filter out the faith-based arguments from our day-to-day activities and actions.
You made a good point there, and I want to comment on that because a lot of people misunderstand this aspect. A lot of folks think separation of church and state is simply keeping religious views out of the public arena, but that's completely and utterly wrong. Religious, atheism is a religion. Any theism is a religion. Polytheism. There's so many religions, right? Monotheism, and so many different varieties. And they're all about the origin of the universe and that kind of thing. So, but the religious people have every right to bring their views out in the public square, as do non-religious people. Just that the governments, when they're making their decisions on difficult situations, they have to be very, very careful, because especially under your constitution, they cannot entangle themselves into a religious situation, right? So I just wanted to clarify, I think in all fairness to everyone, the religious and the non-religious have the same rights to bring their views forward, but neither side can expect the judiciary to favor one or the other, right?
Yeah. And I think that's, I want to give you an opportunity. You did say we kind of put a pin and you wanted to discuss the U.S.'s First Amendment in our Constitution. So I want to give an opportunity to maybe retouch on that, and as well as if you could offer any comparisons and or compare and contrast with how your government addresses that type of situation. Where are the similarities? Where are the differences? Because I think that's like you said, we're working towards the same goal, but we have some different mechanisms in place. I think that's an interesting aspect of this conversation too.
And I was this morning, I was going to take a quick look over our Bill of Rights. So I'm going to be going from memory when I talk about our charter and our Bill of Rights. But yeah, when I was studying for this, I was quite struck by the U.S. Constitution. It's quite an amazing document, and the intent behind it, the founding fathers of the United States, some really great concepts to understand where they were coming from. There's an old saying, I don't know if you've ever heard this saying, but it's an old saying, as goes the king, so goes the country. back in medieval times and back in different centuries,
Mm-hmm.
rulers of countries, just like today still, they want to keep peace.
Mm-hmm.
And so in those days, when governance was different than it is now, it was normally a monarch. If the monarch was a Lutheran, the whole nation is Lutheran. If the monarch was a Catholic, the whole nation's Catholic. And many people paid with their lives dearly for not following that. So when we look at the United States Constitution, you look at the wording of it and you look at the wording of the amendments, they're clearly more to limit the government than the people, including the First Amendment. And so the First Amendment talks a lot of, there's a misconception there that separation of church and state is written down somewhere. It's not written down anywhere. It's not a principle that's written in stone anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It was simply a letter that apparently Thomas Jefferson sent to a Baptist church who was concerned that in a minority they would be discriminated against. And he was reassuring them the wall of separation between church and state would protect them from the dominance of the state. So I'm trying to not ramble too long. I'm not doing very well. But anyway, so that really struck me because it allows for the First Amendment and the Constitution allows for a plurality of religion. Everybody's got their freedom of their religion. It also keeps the state from dominating or getting into religious affairs. And I've done it again. I've rambled so long, I forgot the question.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to. I know we wanted to touch base on the First Amendment. I do think that it's a very. I mean, we could probably have essentially this episode is kind of surrounding that. But I do think that we could have a whole episode surrounding the specific text and the interpretation. I mean, I don't know how many Supreme Court cases in the U.S. are based around the interpretation of that text. But you're right, it does not say the separation of church and state. I believe it's Congress shall not make any laws that respect or take away from
respecting religion, free speech, freedom of the press.
Respect or deny the exercise of religion, essentially. So we're not going to make any laws that say, yes, because it's written in your book, then we're gonna codify it and enforce it in our official rules. But at the same time, we're not going to write any laws that then keep you from practicing anything that's written in your book. You have the freedom to also to adhere to your own moral standards and laws, and that comes back to what you mentioned earlier. As long as that does not end up with your fist in my face, essentially, and that line, I think, is the one that we see constantly butting up against other rights and other values that we share. I think it's a fascinating document as well, and especially the language in that First Amendment is probably a reason why it's the first one.
Incidentally, just so you know, it was not the first. Did you know that?
No, I didn't actually. I was just.
But I'm glad it is the first because it is very important.
Yeah.
Apparently, it was the third, I think, but the first two never got passed or something.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So that was God working.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, no. So you did answer the question. I did. Again, I just wanted to know if there was any comparisons that you saw to how you operate up in Canada, and maybe not even specifically the text of the First Amendment, but just how you address freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom from religion as well.
Yeah, so in our Bill of Rights and our Constitution, it lists our rights, and we have rights of assembly, rights of free speech. But the limiting factor in ours is that are reasonably demonstrable in a free and democratic society. So it's the test of reasonableness, which is a very common test in the judiciary.
Is how they interpret that definition of reasonable.
Yeah.
Well,
I was just looking to see if I had a copy. I thought I had a copy back there.
Yeah, I know. I know. I keep one of the Constitution fairly close. I think it's up on my bookshelf here too. Um, just in case.
In
Just in case the never mind. I'm not going to make any
case the
jokes.
Supreme Court judge calls you up and says, Chris, I need a hand here.
I was yeah. I'm not going to make any King of England jokes here. Just kind of closing out here because I think we've had a very interesting, well-rounded discussion about our perspectives on this. Where do you see the common ground between people of all different faiths, not just our not and again not just faith, but worldview that could be religious or non-religious. Where do you see common ground being found that can facilitate well-being and fairness in governance for a society?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Powerful question. You know, and I don't mean to disrespect anybody's views here. I simply stating where I think the answer lies so that we can all live in peace and harmony and hopefully never go to war again and never uh, enacting violence upon each other. We have the spectrum that we commonly call the left and the right. And these days, there's so many factors coming together to create this, but all we're ever hearing nowadays is the far left and the far right views. And we're hearing so many of them so strongly, and they're very polarized. And I would encourage everyone to remember the reason they're called the left and the right is because if you draw a line, they're at both ends of the spectrum. And we all remember the old yin and the yang, right? Where balance and reasonableness is the answer to everything, and that is the answer to everything. And every one of us, should we get up every morning and look in the mirror, we need to question ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Where am I? Am I on the left? Am I on the right? Wherever I am, is that the correct place to be? And where is the correct place to be? And I believe the correct place to be is right smack in the middle on any issue, but on an issue of this importance, it's so important that we be in the middle. What do I mean by in the middle? Well, let's use a common example. If you're way on the right, you believe strongly in the capitalist system. If you're way on the left, you believe strongly in a socialist system. Why can't we come together and create a system where those that want to live in a capitalist manner can live in a capitalist manner, go and run your business, seek out your wealth, but if by the grace of God or by the grace of whatever, the universe and things working in your favor, you achieve great success. The greater success you have, the greater responsibility you have for those who lose at this system. Right? So both of us, both sides of the coin need to find something for everybody. We're never, ever, ever going to have peace, except the left view, the right view. I just don't see that ever leading to peace. So wrap it up. We all have to give a little bit. I got to pull my fist out of your face. I got to pull back a little bit. You got to pull your fist out of my face. I got to give you a little bit of something. You got to give me a little bit of something. And you know what? At the end of the day, we just agree. We're not going to agree on everything, but let's give everybody a little bit of what they need. And I think that's the only way forward. I don't see any other way forward.
Yeah. Yeah. The balance is definitely, I mean, that's, for my personal philosophy, that's what I strive for as well, to varying degrees of success, depending on how much coffee I've had or, what kind of day I've been having. But I agree with you on that. The finding that balance, I think, is extremely important. It was one of the reasons that this podcast exists is to explore these topics and not necessarily try to convince one way or the other, but to get these ideas out there and to allow us as human beings to communicate with each other and see what our different perspectives of these spectrums are and where we're at and gain some understanding about one another. And, and see where that goes. And hopefully that kind of helps bring us all into that balance together. So with that, I just want to, again, I want to thank you for taking the time, and I want to give you an opportunity to close out with anything that maybe we didn't cover, or anything that's kind of come up that you want to bring up before we do close out the show.
I just want to pick up one statement just picking up on what you just said, really, and that is that I think your podcast, what you're trying to achieve, I think is a fantastic thing. There's so many fora for the influential and the powerful to speak in our world, but there's no good fora these days, or forum, for the common folk to get together and discuss the important issues with a moderator like yourself to keep everybody playing nice in the sandbox. I think it's a fantastic idea, and I encourage everyone and anyone to get involved and just talk on your podcast and talk things out. I think it's wonderful, and I'm glad you invited me on. I really appreciate it, and that's really all I wanted to add.
Yeah, well, your time is very appreciated, Gerald. And again, you yourself have a very fascinating and interesting podcast. You want to give a quick synopsis of what you do there and what it's called and where people can find it?
Sure. Our podcast, I have my sidekick, Dan. We call him Dan Fondo. I'm Dry Toast. And it's called The Fact of the Matter. And we delve into, well, somewhat similar to yours, not a lot, but we delve into historical situations. We delve into religious, scientific, philosophical situations, much of it historical. We get into some specific battles. We get into situations that are really heavily discussed, and we seek the facts behind them. For example, one of our first episodes was on the Galileo affair between the Catholic Church and Galileo. What really happened? And if anyone listens to that, I apologize. It was one of our first ones, so the sound wasn't that great. But those are the kind of things we delve into. We just recently delve into historic battles. We looked at the Battle of Thermopylae, where the 300 Spartans held off the Persian army. We looked into the facts around that. So we get into the facts of these kind of situations, and you can find it on almost any podcast carrier. We're carried widely. There's a couple of them called Fact of the Matter. Ours is The Fact of the Matter, and our picture or logo is a magnifying glass magnifying. I forget what it's magnifying. I think it just says The Fact of the Matter or something. So we're to symbolize us using a magnifying glass to find the facts.
Yeah, I that's how I found it. It was your explanation is very self-explanatory there. I was able to find it no problem when I was researching this podcast as well, and I highly recommend everybody go out and listen to that too, because you guys do dive deep into a lot of these subjects. It's very fascinating and interesting conversations that I think anybody interested in the conversations that we're having here, it's a very complimentary show as well. So I just wanted
and we throw a little silly dad humor into our show.
on with that, being a silly dad myself, it resonated with me too. So I mean, Gerald, really, I appreciate your time. I know, we had some cancellations. This was supposed to be a larger conversation between three different viewpoints. And due to, unforeseen circumstances, we did lose two of our guests. And I really appreciate you still taking the time out of your day and, being willing to come and kind of being put on the hot seat here, and answer the questions and chat with me for an hour almost. I really appreciate your perspective, and I wish you well and nothing but success moving forward.
Chris, thank you so much, and the same to you as well. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, cheers. All right, that was a really fun and interesting conversation. Once again, my hat is off to Gerald for coming on and carrying the weight of the discussion today. Gerald, aka Jerry, aka Dry Toast, is the host of his own podcast, The Fact of the Matter, where he researches the facts behind many controversial historic battles and religious, scientific, and philosophical issues. Together with his sidekick Dan Fondo, they delve deep into the facts and inject a little humor along the way. Being both a man of science and a man of religion, as well as a history buff, he has a strong personal interest in exploring all of those areas. I personally have listened to a few of the episodes, and I highly recommend you go check it out and give these creators some support. As usual, if you are enjoying the show, please subscribe to the podcast feed on Apple, Spotify, TuneIn, or wherever else you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube and soon to be Twitch. Finally, if you're on Clubhouse, follow me at Melting Pot Talks and come say hi. If you're interested in joining as a guest, shoot me an email at meltingpottalks@gmail.com or sign up for a free account at www.meltingpottalks.com and click on Join the Conversation at the top of the screen. Thank you all again. This has been another episode of Melting Pot Talks. I'm your host, Chris. Be well and be good to each other.